This morning, ladies and gentlemen, we have the honor and privilege of welcoming Mr. Otto Schmidt. Otto has been interested in natural history and especially birds, and has been a member of the Cape Bird Club since his school days. He became more active in the club in 1986 and started a 10-year stint as chairman in 1989. This was followed by a 17-year spell as co-editor of the club magazine, Primropsy. He has taken keen interest in bird and nature photography, particularly since his retirement in 2006. Apart from the good knowledge of his local patch, which includes Kirstenbosch and his lovely wife, Sandy, also a keen birder, have traveled widely, most of their holidays having strong natural historical focus. They have visited countries like Australia, Ecuador, Costa Rica, Madagascar. In Africa, they've also been all over. You know, we're talking Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, Ghana, as well as most of Southern countries, Southern African countries, with Namibia being a firm favorite. The presentation today looks at a trip they undertook in November 2019, their first joint visit to northern KwaZulu-Natal, one of South Africa's premier birding destination. Now, Mr. Otto, it's an absolute pleasure and privilege to welcome you. Thank you for gracing us with your presence. We are all sending our virtual hugs to you, and we look forward to this wonderful talk. Without any waste of time, ladies and gentlemen, please put your virtual hands together and welcome Mr. Otto Schmidt. Everybody, I will see you guys on the other side of the presentation. Take it away, Mr. Otto.
Thank you, John. Hope you can all hear me. Thanks all of you for joining in, and I hope you'll enjoy this talk. Northern KwaZulu-Natal, as all Cape Townians know, is a very long way from here. So somehow my wife and I had never actually got there together. So when the trip was advertised by Reach Africa Birding operating out of Johannesburg, we signed up and had to then fly to Joburg and travel from there. So the trip was a 12-day trip, and it included flying up to Johannesburg, spending a night over there, and then another night there on the way back. So without further ado, this was our guest house in Johannesburg, where we spent one night and had the afternoon free. So we did a bit of birding around there just to familiarize ourselves a little bit with the birds of that part of the world. Karoo thrush, all Cape Townians will know the olive thrush. This is its near neighbor, which occurs inland. A bird we all know, southern masked weaver, quite common down here, but pretty widespread across the country. Crested barbet, not a common bird for Cape Town, so a nice one to catch up with. And of course, the bird we all love to hate down here and everywhere else is the common myna. Unfortunately, very much entrenched in Johannesburg these days, having pretty much traveled up from Durban many years ago. The next morning, bright and early, with Graham Snow, our Reach Africa co-host, we left Johannesburg. On the way out, we had these Orange River francolins in the grasslands heading east of Joburg. And we birded in a couple of rather unusual sort of places on the way down. This doesn't look like much of a habitat at all, but even so, there was a wetland on the other side of the fence with some quite good stuff in it. So it pays to pick up on these things as you're going. We had a brief stop in Piet Retief to join for the last member of our group to join, who traveled across from Swaziland. So that was an easy way for her to get to meet us up rather than having to travel all the way back to Johannesburg. We then headed further up and heading upwards into the sort of highland areas. You get your total change of scenery and some really interesting birds such as southern bald ibis, a bird we certainly don't get down here, but quite common in the sort of Drakensberg area these days. We then hit KwaZulu-Natal and traveled down via the Josini Dam area. And this map just gives you an idea of our destinations for the trip. We came in sort of top left of the map and then traveled right down to the bottom first It looks a bit erratic, but there is a reason for doing it in this particular order, which will become apparent later on. So our first destination was at the bottom at Hluhluwe. And this was our accommodation for the first couple of nights. Very nice bush baby lodge, sort of on the outskirts of town, but right stuck away in the bush. Very comfortable chalets and surrounded by some lovely vegetation and a very big garden with lots of birds, which is obviously what we were looking for. This was the swimming pool, which we didn't use, but which does become quite relevant a little bit later on, as you'll see. The campsite adjacent to the bungalows was also nice and spacious and gave the campers a very nice view of the waterhole with some of the game on the other side of the fence, which you could watch at quite close quarters. Our first morning trip was down to the top end of Lake St. Lucia to the False Bay Park, and a lovely setting where we sort of stopped, had a breakfast stop on the edge of the lake and did what we could as far as birding down there was concerned. One of our favorite birds of the trip was the Crested Guinea fowl, which has that sort of afro hairstyle, which is always very amusing to see. And they were quite common in and around the lake and at various other spots during the trip. Little egret, lots of us know as a sort of lakeside bird, and this one's prominently sort of eyeing its breakfast. Lovely golden-tailed woodpecker on a dead snag right next to the space where we were having our breakfast. A couple of smaller birds in the slight distance, but birds that we were not familiar with in Cape Town. Red-breasted swallow, very attractive bird that nests in holes in the sides of the road, and yellow-rumped tinkerbird. And our first mammal of note is the little lovely red duiker, which we fortunately saw several times. Very attractive little mammal. And another one, African bush squirrel, which took a little bit of looking through the books to work out exactly what it was, but very cute. And I don't think any of us had actually seen one before. This was one of my wife Sandy's pictures. How she managed to spot this through the undergrowth, I don't know. It took me quite a while to actually get my binoculars onto it. She managed to get a nice view of this red-chested cuckoo, also known as the Pygmy, which I'm sure many of you will have heard during these summer months. A bird I've wanted to photograph for a very long time was this purple-crested turako sitting in a fig tree having its breakfast. Lovely bird, generally found fairly high up and quite difficult to see amongst the foliage, but this fig tree had almost no leaves on it, so it was very nice and out in the open. One of the more attractive robins, now known as robin chats, the white-throated, also a bird of the sort of more northeastern parts of the country. And we have Cape Bathurst down there, one of our favorite endemics in the fynbos. This is one of its cousins, the chin spot. And the chin spot is named after the female, which has a brown spot under the chin. This is the male. So the name actually relates to the female of the species. And striped kingfisher sitting on the wires as we headed back to camp after our morning excursion. And at the camp, one of the scrub robins, sometimes quite difficult to pick up, but fairly easy in this instance, was sitting out very nicely, calling away in the early morning. In the camp, yellow-bellied greenbull, and you can see why it has that name. We then saw another one a bit later, which really confused us for a while, as you'll see, and it's still a yellow-bellied greenbull, but very much more pale underneath and possibly a young bird. It certainly had us guessing for a little while. Crowned hornbill, an attractive sort of forest-related hornbill, which is always found up the sort of eastern seaboard wherever there's some fairly dense trees and forests with lots of fruit for it to catch up with. A bird I've wanted to photograph for a long time. Unfortunately, there was a pair actually nesting in the accommodation we were staying at. You can see the white-eared barbet. They had a nest in this particular dead snag, which they've managed to perforate quite successfully in looking for food, but very attractive little barbet. And fortunately showed really nicely during our stay. And the lovely, used to be Natal robin, now called red-capped robin chat, which was singing away near the entrance. Another really pretty bird, which we don't get down our way, but very nice to see. And one of the many sunbirds in Southern Africa, purple banded, again restricted to the sort of more forested areas of the country. And red-billed oxpeckers. And wherever you get oxpeckers, you're going to need something for them to feed on. And sure enough, on the other side of the fence was a waterhole, which I had mentioned previously, where the nyalas were coming in to drink on a fairly regular basis. And the oxpeckers obviously were in the area to take advantage of these sort of mammal intrusions into their space. There's a female nyala. There were lots of them, and fortunately the game area had nothing dangerous in it, so one could walk through it quite safely. And it was a really nice place to do a big, long, sweeping walk one afternoon and catch up with whatever was on offer, such as this beautiful violet-backed starling. Used to be called plum-colored, which possibly was a more attractive name, but we've got to stick to the new names these days. And square-tailed drongo, as you can see, we're now getting fork-tailed drongos all over Cape Town, and square-tailed isn't actually square-tailed, but the fork is very much shallower than the ones we know down here. And again, it's a very much forest-related bird. One of the LBJs, but pale flycatcher, showing rather nicely on the walk through the forest. And then not the best picture, but a bird which was a lifer for Sandy, and one that I'd only seen once or twice many years ago was the grey waxbill, which was in a mixed group of small seed eaters down in amongst the grasses. And one of those was a bird that we really didn't expect to see up there, which was a green twin spot. Again, not the greatest picture, but a really tiny bird that's quite hard to catch up with on occasion. So we were quite lucky with that one. Then back at camp, dinner was at 7 p.m. and this is the dining area with a sort of open on the side so you could watch what was going on. But dinner was at 7 for us, but not only for us, because as you can see on the sign, it's also bush baby feeding time at 7 p.m. So before we were served, the bush babies had to get their bit. And sure enough, once their rations were put out, they duly arrived. And it was really nice to be able to see them up close. This is the thick-tailed bush baby, and several of them came down to catch up with all the fruit that had been put out for them. Really cute guys to see and see really well. And I guess Bush Baby Lodge is actually named after these particular very attractive mammals. And something we didn't expect was that during that second evening, whilst we were having dinner, it started to rain. And it rained for a very long time after that. But it was almost as soon as the rain started, this character came hopping out of the manager's office, where it had obviously been hibernating during the dry season, and bounced out through the dining hall to take advantage of the rain that was falling outside. And I'd mentioned the swimming pool previously. Well, we woke up early the next morning and there were just toads croaking absolutely everywhere. And once we looked at the pool, it was full of toads. They'd obviously made a beeline for the water. But apparently the chlorine doesn't do their eyes any good. So this is Graham, our tour leader. And then one of the attendants from the chalets was busy hooking these toads out as fast as they came in. But the males were all sitting around the edge displaying like crazy. And some of them had already got lucky and were copulating. But of course, in a pool that's kept going with chlorine, this is not a great idea. So they were being taken out and put back in the garden as fast as they came in. Something else that arrived as a result of the rain was this particular large land snail, which is quite an impressive beast. And then we did one last walk through the garden in the drizzle, waiting to finish up our breakfast and get going again. And there was a pair of collared sunbirds feeding this chick, which was rather nice to see. another forest-related sunbird, which we just about doesn't quite make it to Cape Town, but if you go up the garden route around Plett and places like that, you will start seeing this bird. Birchall's cuckoo, also known as the rainbird, because I don't think it likes the rain, but as soon as the rain clears, it sits up top and tries to warm up and dry its feathers off. So it's easiest to see when the rain has eased and the sun has come back out. This one was still looking rather bedraggled. As you can see, we're heading for an area known as the Novella Peninsula, north of Hluhluwe, and it was now very wet. So much so that when we parked and met up with the local bird guide, you can see it's not the nicest weather and conditions were pretty awful. We were looking for a particular long claw on this grassland, but no one in the vehicle, which fortunately had a canopy roof, was decided, other than Graham and the guide, was going anywhere to see what they could find. And we eventually decided that we could see a few things in the distance, but looking for long claws in the pouring rain was not an option. So we decided to get out of there before the weather deteriorated such that the road became impassable. Already it was pretty slippery and slidey. So that was a miss, unfortunately. From there, we headed north from Hluhluwe, and our next destination was a place I'd seen in the literature a few times called Muzi Pan. Supposed to be a really good birding destination, but that's about as much as I knew about it. When we arrived, it didn't look that auspicious, with these cattle heading off across the bridge, going down to the water, and thinking, well, what can there be here with all this sort of animal and human life around? But we were very pleasantly surprised very quickly. This is the one on the drier side of the road, let's say the less vegetated side. And on the other side, there was a very active weaver colony with two species of weaver. This is the village weaver. And also its sort of near relative, the lesser masked weaver. Different from our southern, which has a red eye, this one has a yellow eye ring, which makes it quite distinctive. And its black facial patch on the male is also slightly different from ours. Also trooping around in the wet and known as the lily trotter because of its very large toes, it can sort of span a water lily leaf and makes it easy for them to walk on with these African jacana. Adult on the left, juvenile on the right. Squawko heron, very rare visitor to Cape Town, but quite common in the more sort of subtropical parts of the country up north. The whole mix of water birds taking advantage of the sandbars and the grassland and the water. Pied kingfisher, one of our favorite pink kingfishers, probably the most common one across the country. And quite a rare bird, but also at quite a distance, was this Allen's gallinule, which we managed to spot just before it disappeared into the thicket at the back there. A nice one to get for our list. And you can see the water hyacinth, which Cape Town is now also experiencing in quite large quantities on a lot of our wetlands. On the other side of the road, there was much less vegetation and much more open water, local fishermen, which didn't seem to deter the birds at all because there was lots going on in the shallow water with cattle, people, and everything else. And a couple of groups that we identified, such as these Hottentot teal at the top, and a whole flock of whiskered terns down below, all taking advantage of the shallow water. And a number of dragonflies for those people keen on those. Unfortunately, I haven't managed to get around to working out exactly which species these are, but they perched rather nicely and made for some nice photographs. Then we headed north through a number of villages. This one, the name was just a little bit too much to pronounce, but it made for quite a nice sort of thing to add in. And we were heading north to that very well-known game reserve in Ndumo, which is right up on the northern tip of KwaZulu-Natal on the Mozambique border. This is a map of the reserve. The rest camp is down on the bottom right. Some of the roads are accessible in your own vehicle. Some of the others, some of the better birding destinations, you have to use their local sort of morning drives to access, which we did, and we were there for a couple of nights. As soon as we went in, we saw that probably the most common animal in the reserve was actually giraffe, and we saw these in quite large numbers. A distant view of a cuckoo just above the road as we came in. Generally, they don't hang around, but fortunately this one did. And it showed really nicely, which allowed us to see it back and front and identify it properly as an African cuckoo, as opposed to its European cousin, the European cuckoo, which also comes down as a migrant. But this was very distinctly the African cuckoo. Ndumo Rest Camp, where we unhitched our trailer and checked in. And this is the sort of reception desk, and the little wheelbarrow on the right there was very useful for transporting our luggage to the various chalets, which were quite widely spaced. Here's Graham getting stuck in, moving our goodies all over the place. Once we checked in, we heard this tweet, and above our doorway on our chalet was this lesser striped swallow welcoming us. It had a nest on the side, so it was around for most of the time that we were there. There are various places one can access, and one is the sand forest, which we went through to early in the morning. This was one of my more frustrating experiences on the trip. It said it was going to rain quite heavily, so unfortunately I left my big camera and long lens in the chalet as I didn't want it to get wet. And I apologize for this very poor picture of an African broadbill, but it was just sort of, I just wasn't equipped to take a picture. And of course it didn't rain, so my camera would have been perfectly all right. And it was rather annoying that we just couldn't really get a handle on this rather cute little guy that was displaying in the forest. And it was the only really good view we had of it during the trip. Unfortunately, these things do happen every so often. Driving around, there's a vulture restaurant in the reserve. These are not really carrion eaters as such. They're palm nut vultures, of which there's a small colony up in northern Natal, and it was really nice to see them perched on the trees. The one on the right is an adult, the one on the left is a juvenile. I think this was a lifer for Sandy, so it was really nice to get to grips with these after many years of looking. Then there were a couple of bird hides and a couple of tracks that you could access in your own vehicle, and this is us heading down to one of the hides where you could look out over the pan and catch up with this colony of yellow weavers, which were getting into breeding mode. This male is just starting a nest. One of the others had got a little bit further, and they were really getting ready to breed as the rains had just started. So it was the start of their season. You also had a bit of a view over the floodplain. Water level was still quite a long way from the hide, but you could see quite large groups of yellow-billed storks, open-billed storks, saddle-billed storks, and various other things, which we hope to get better views of the next morning. And again, lots of ducks and things on the edge of the pan, and the sort of fever tree forest in the background. And a slightly closer look, large group of lesser flamingos with a whole load of other things mixed in with them. Slightly lower, better view of some yellow-billed stork and a great egret, both feeding on the edge of the pan. And then whilst walking back from the hide towards the vehicle, here are some of these little termite mounds that have been pushed up by this particular species of termite in response to the good rains and the nice soft soil. There were various other things which you could see whilst you're walking through the bush, where you got sort of up close and personal to nature. And here was an interesting spider sitting on the corner of its web looking out for prey. And then something that Sandy is still very bitter about is that she didn't see this python. I'd lagged behind to take some pictures. The rest of the group had walked on, and although I called, no one could hear me because they were already gone too far ahead. When this huge rock python came across the path right in front of me, I couldn't get it all into one picture, so I had to take a sequence. This is a part of it, another part of it, and eventually it disappeared. It was very, very large, and it was a really beautiful view. Unfortunately, and I've just been kicked by my wife because she's still smarting under the effect that she didn't get to see it, rather sadly. Anyway, we then headed to the top corner of the reserve, and this is known as Red Rocks, and looking across the river is Mozambique. So you're right at the very top end of South Africa in KZN. This was our group, except for me, of course. So we were a very small group, only 5 of us, with Graham, second from the left, who owns Reach Africa Birding. And looking down from this viewpoint, there were various things going on in the river down below, mainly birds, but also a fisherman walking across with his catch from Mozambique into South Africa. Obviously, there's no border control, and he didn't seem too fussed by the fact that the river had quite a large number of crocodiles in it. Anyway, he'd obviously done this before. White-tailed swallows perched out on the edge, overlooking the river where there were lots of insects for them to hunt. And then one of my favorite birds was this red-fronted tinkerbird, which suddenly appeared. It's very small, but it popped out right in front of us, and I managed to get a really nice photograph of it, which was a real bonus. Then heading back towards camp, there's been a pretty heavy storm. They don't have elephants, so this is not elephant damage. This is just wind damage, and we had to do a bit of roadside clearing to be able to get through. As I mentioned, lots of giraffe. You don't often see them sitting down, but when they are, you can get really up close and have a good look at the red-billed oxpeckers, which obviously have quite a good time cleaning up the parasites and ticks and things on these giraffe. Lovely kudu bull in one of the little side tracks, looking at us and wondering whether it should make a run for it. And loved one of these beautiful emerald cuckoos. Again, in full sunlight, the colors would show up really nicely, but this one was trying to dry off after getting quite drenched. And you can see on the right, it's still looking quite bedraggled. And again, the rainbird in the rain, looking very unhappy with life, but hoping for better things to come. Then the next morning on a drive with the guide from the camp, we headed back down to one of the pans. And this was going via the vulture restaurant again, but these aren't vultures, these are woolly-necked storks feeding on the remains. And this isn't a vulture either, but you can see it's raining quite heavily. It's a pretty terrible picture. We identified it as a tawny eagle, but when I got back and downloaded the pictures, it just didn't look quite right. So I bounced it off a couple of raptor specialists, and they said, no, it's one of the migrant eagles from up north, which was a lesser spotted, which was rather nice. We had to amend our bird list a little bit when we got home. Then heading down through the bush, this lovely golden-breasted bunting perched out in quite good light for a change. Lovely little bee-eater. Down in a little bit of a sort of sloot where the water was running into the pan was this pair of water thickneys, known as water dickop back in the day. And then these lovely African Pygmy Kingfishers, who are actually not fish eaters, they are insect eaters. So they often are well away from water. And this pair, you can see the tips of their bills are still quite muddy. They were busy digging their nest hole in the side of this little bank. And here you can get a slightly better view. It looks a bit, it's the size of our Malachite Kingfisher, but the coloration is quite different. And it's a really beautiful little bird, which comes south in summer, but doesn't come down as far as Cape Town, unfortunately. At the other end of the scale is this large martial eagle looking for prey over the floodplain. And then as we got to near Meaty Pan, which is the main pan at Ndumo, but you can't access it unless you're with the guide. Again, the water birds we'd seen from a distance the day before were now a lot closer. And of course, bottom left fish eagle has to be there. The white-faced duck at the top were in large numbers, and great egrets and other birds feeding there. This is our drive along the pan through this lovely fever tree forest, which is really quite a magnificent area to be able to drive through. General view of the pan and various water birds and these lovely green fever trees. which you were probably named because it's a really good area for mosquitoes in summer. And the name Fever Tree probably comes about from the fact that if you were going to catch malaria, this was as good a place as any if you were one of the early travelers. Parked on the edge of the pan and looking out with us is one of the other folks who joined us for the morning drive. And here we're looking at what's available. White-fronted plover, a bird we all know from our coastline down in Cape Town, but these are the sort of inland race, so the coloration is quite different from ours, but it's the same species. Saddlebill stork, one of the big and very impressive storks, adult on the left, juvenile on the right. Reflection of its legs makes it look particularly tall. And one of my favorite pictures is this sort of the black-winged stolt chatting to its friend, the water thickney. And these great white pelicans, not all that great and white, but obviously in going into breeding plumage where they get some really interesting sort of rufous coloration on them, surrounded by a number of other water birds. And of course, crocodiles are everywhere, and some of these were quite large and impressive. Hence my comment about the guy walking across the river with his fish. He obviously knew what to look out for. It also gave you the chance to do a bit of wader identification with a wood sandpiper, and it's very speckled back on the left and the ruff on the right. Similar in size, but two different birds. Great egret catching its breakfast, which it downed very quickly. 1, 2, 3, and it was gone, and the next one was about to be spied out. And then from there, we headed south from Ndumo to Sodwana Bay, completely different habitat and for a completely different reason. Here we stayed at Nzeni Bush Lodge, which was right on the edge of the coast. Very nice accommodation. We had a house to ourselves, apart from the odd intruder, such as the scorpion, which we found on the carpet just inside the entrance where we checked in. But you had a nice deck where you could sit out and have your coffee in the outside, and there was a nice big tree which overhung the stoop. So the Samango monkeys looked in to see if there was anything that we'd left out for them. You had to make sure you cleared the table whenever you came inside. The beach was just down the way on this wooden boardwalk, but unfortunately it was very windy and quite unpleasant on the beach with sand blowing everywhere. But on a good day, I can imagine it would be a really lovely place to have a walk, but it was something you didn't want to stay out there for too long because you really got sand blasted. We didn't do too much birding, particularly me, as I managed to catch a severe case of Delhi belly from somewhere I don't know. So I was a bit laid up on the day we were there, but I did manage to wander around the campsite a little bit and catch up with the scrub robin. And one of our favorite birds was the Crested Guinea fowl, and up close they really do have a very much Afro look about them and really pretty birds to see. Very common and not that skittish at all, so you've got some really good close-up views. Yeah, and they were known as Bob Marley chickens up there, and you can see why. As I mentioned, there was a big tree overhanging the deck of the house we were staying in, and the pair of violet-backed starlings was obviously breeding nearby because this was their favorite perch. This is the female, very attractive, but of course its male counterpart is really quite striking in the breeding season. And they were very, very nice to be able to see up close. Our main reason for going to Sodwana Bay wasn't birding, however. It was a tour that Graham had booked for us with Ufudu Tours, which was a turtle watching trip. So in the evening, fortunately before my Delhi belly really got stuck into me, we drove up and down after dark looking for nesting turtles, for which this particular piece of coastline is well known. It took a fair bit of doing, and it was drizzling, so it wasn't the most pleasant weather, but we eventually found this female loggerhead right at the top of the beach. She just finished laying a clutch of eggs and was just covering them up in the sand. And she then dragged herself back down to the water and safely headed out to sea again, having got her clutch of eggs safely laid, hopefully, and probably would return in due course to lay some more. So it was really quite a magical experience to be able to see this event, which happens up that part of the world. Unfortunately, the location of the eggs is very carefully marked and monitored. So hopefully a lot of these young turtles do make it into the sea once they've hatched. From Sodwana, we then headed inland again with a short stop at Muzipan before going back up north. Muzipan, this time we did a walk around the sort of western side of the pan, which was really lovely habitat. Was still, the weather wasn't the greatest even now, but it was still very nice to be able to walk out and catch up with this pink-backed pelican, which is a bird we don't know from down here, but it was really nice to see. And in the bottom left picture, you can just about see why it's called pink-backed. Again, you've got to see them flying at a right angle to be able to see that color on it. A little bit smaller than our great white pelican, but quite a nice species to get to grips with. Tembe Elephant Park is right up north, and if you look at the left-hand map, you can see it right next to Ndumo. And I said to Graham, well, why did we go up and down and up and down? Why didn't we just go from Ndumo to Tembe? And he said, well, the main reason was I was leaving the best till last, and he was certainly right as far as Tembe was concerned. It really was the highlight. It was nice to be able to finish the trip on a highlight of that sort. We didn't stay in the park. We stayed at the Royal Tango Safari Lodge, which is in the bottom right-hand corner, but just outside the reserve, but with its own game fence area, own gate. So you were effectively in the reserve, but you weren't in it, but you could be in it within a couple of minutes. And you had to go in with the local guide from the Safari Lodge, which also was very, very handy. The lodge itself was lovely with these beautiful boardwalks laid out, lovely accommodation, a beautiful sort of dining and recreation area laid out where you could sit and relax, have a drink or have your meals. And you never quite knew what was likely to come in. This came in, unfortunately, it obviously flew into one of the very large windows with a little Pygmy Kingfisher and is promptly being photographed sitting on the floor in a rather sort of dazed state. But we picked it up, put it outside, and after a couple of minutes, it kind of dusted itself off and flew off, none the worse for wear, fortunately. So there were things happening in and around the lodge. You didn't really have to go anywhere to catch up with some interesting sightings, such as this bobo, which I photographed through the windows from inside while we were having our meals. And on the window was this very massive rain spider. And then just outside was a variety of other things which you could get a good close look at, including this wasp, which had just caught its caterpillar prey and was just busy ferrying it down its hole so it could lay its egg and get its maggot going in its next life cycle. And this movement of grasshoppers across one of the boardwalks as we were walking down into the forest. And some lovely vegetation for you to get to grips with, and in quite safe surroundings, because anywhere you could walk on the lodge grounds, there was no danger from anything, although you were practically on the edge of the reserve. Next morning, with their driver, he's opening the gate and then unhooking the electric fence at the back, which separates the Safari Lodge from the Tembe Reserve itself. Heading in, still driving down the fence, and birding was sort of picked up almost immediately with these red-backed manakins. Another crowned hornbill, which we'd seen early on in the trip, still perched on the electric fence. And lemon-breasted canary, one of the sort of northern specials that birders from down here always like to get to grips with. The male on the left with its lemon breast and the female down on the right. And of course, Tembe Elephant Park is called that because of its very large tuskers. And here we are getting up close and personal with one of them. Sort of almost immediately we entered the reserve. But of course, being a birder, you look a bit more around what's going on. And if you see on that arrow on the left-hand corner, there's a bird right next to the elephant. Unfortunately, the bird moved, went across onto the fence, and it was a croaking cisticola, another one of those birds that we were looking for, which perched rather nicely whilst we were looking at the big tusker. Heading through into the wetland area of the park, this woolly-necked stork, and very close to the vehicle, almost, we didn't quite run it over, but it was a close call, was this crested francolin scuttling across the road. Flappet lark, one of the LBJs, but one of those that's not always the easiest to see. You generally see them 50 foot up in the air calling and as a tiny spot against the sky, but this one perched for a change. Of course, looking at mammals as well as birds, we got to grips with a common duiker, or nice to see in the forest, and another one of those very attractive little red duikers. White-faced duck in one of the pans. And I don't know how I spotted this, but I managed to catch up with a flap-necked chameleon, and the rest of the people on the vehicle took a while to be convinced that there was actually a chameleon sitting on a branch off to our right. We all got to see it eventually. Very well camouflaged. I'm not too sure how I spotted, but I'm very glad I did. Then in the late afternoon, it's drinks time out in nature, and you find a nice open spot. There are lions in the park, but you made quite sure you parked somewhere where you had good visibility all around. We didn't see the lions, and it was certainly a good place for a sundowner. And Graham was equipped with all the necessary, so we had a nice relaxing time. And then heading back to the camp with some of the other folks who were staying there at the same time. We were out a bit longer than most people would tend to be, but that was because we were looking for night birds as well as other things. And here's a nice big herd of buffalo out in the late afternoon, evening light, with lots of oxpeckers all over them. So oxpeckers were really getting in on the act. African wattled lapwing also on the side of the road in the late afternoon light. And this lovely black-bellied bustard. Scrub hares, which you don't really see during the day, but late afternoon, they start bouncing around all over the show. And of course, as the light faded, the beautiful sunsets came in, and that wasn't really our focus either, but we were looking for nightjars. And nightjars aren't really out there until it's almost too dark to see. So with a spotlight, we managed to pick up a couple before our driver decided it was best we get out of the park while we could still have a glimmer of light. But at least we managed to catch up with two species of nightjars. One quite rare, the swamp nightjar, which I didn't manage to photograph, but I don't think any of us had seen before. So it was a really nice bird to catch up with. This one's more common. And I got a nice picture of the female and a not so good picture of the male down on the right. Here we are now the next morning after a nice night in the reserve, heading back into the park and going on a different route to one of the big hides, which is near the main camp, which we weren't staying at, but which is sort of also accessible from our lodge. It's known for its elephant sightings. When we first got there, it was mainly waterbuck, but then the big ellie started coming in and we could sit and watch them really nicely at quite close quarters as the family groups came in from all over the place and started enjoying themselves at the water and in the mud and just generally having a great time. From there, we drove through completely different sort of sandfeld habitat with lots of trees, whereas in the grassland, there weren't that many trees. And as soon as you get big trees, you start seeing different species of birds, such as this lovely broad-billed roller, and a number of raptors. We'd seen very few raptors to date, but this brown snake eagle was one that we had picked up a couple of times, but the Bateleur was a new one for us. as was this African Harrier hawk, still called gymnogene by a number of people. One on the right is a juvenile taking advantage of the shade, so it looks a little bit light and dark on the picture. And then the one we were very glad to spot was this African cuckoo hawk, which was eyeing us before heading off when we got a little bit too close for comfort. The nice picnic spot where we could stop for coffee, have a look around, go to the loo and just generally stretch our legs and look at what was around. And we found this little baby bird, which looked like it really shouldn't be out there in doing its own thing at this stage. And we really didn't know what it was either for a while, until the adult turned up and told us in no uncertain terms that we're in its patch. So we retreated and left the puff back to look after its youngster. On the way back, redback shrike, a migrant from the north, which we'd expected to see many of, but funnily enough, this was the only one we saw, and it was a female, which was really quite a surprise. We expected quite a few of them to be around. Scrub robins perched out in the sunfelt, and of course, every so often, one of the local elephants would block our way for a while. But the guide obviously knew that they were just sort of making a point and weren't really an issue. We just sat and watched, and eventually it would trundle past us at quite close quarters and head off back into the bush. Where there are elephants, there are elephant droppings. So these dung beetles are really getting stuck in and making sure that they got their dung balls organized for them to lay their eggs into. Rufous-napped lark calling loudly from very, very close to the vehicle. Not often you see them at such close quarters. Then back at the camp, the swimming pool was certainly an attraction, but there were lots of little forest paths to explore. So we decided that, hot as it was, we would rather do a bit of walking and see what we could find. One of the tracks that you could walk down on, and this rather untidy looking nest, which I staked out for a bit and eventually found what had made it. It was this dark-backed, previously known as forest weaver. Quite a shy bird, so it was really nice to be able to get a good view of it. We have our Cape bulbul with its sort of regular white eye ring. This is the one that occurs up north, which is the dark-capped bulbul. And of course, Klaas's cuckoo perched really beautifully and calling away like crazy. It was nice to see, all in the camp. And then eventually we also found a pair of African wood owls in one of the clearings. Looking up above us, there was this pair with its youngster down on the right, giving us the beady eye, and very nice to see, but usually quite difficult to pick up in the forest. Another bird that's typical of that part of the world, Woodward's batis. And the nearguard sunbird, which is the sort of northern forest equivalent of our southern double-collared, the main difference being that it has this very dark, sort of almost black belly, whereas our southern obviously has a very pale grey white belly. And it's again a very sort of sought after forest species from northern Natal. Little bee-eater was in the car park when we were packing up, and whilst I was watching it, I managed to spot one of the birds I'd really wanted to see on the trip. We'd had very fleeting glances of, but not good ones. Still not the best view, but this pink-throated twin spot was one of the sort of birds that we were really looking for. This is the female. And eventually, with a bit of searching in the undergrowth, I managed to find the male. Not a great view, but it was a very nice bird to see, and pretty much the last bird we saw as we headed out of Tembe and started heading back inland. It was still raining, as you can see, and these cows kept us sort of going for a while whilst we had to slowly inch our way through them and make sure they stayed out of the way. Back on the main road, we again crossed Jesini Dam, where we stopped briefly. The top of the arrow under there is a peregrine falcon, which you are unlikely to get a good view of unless you have a telescope. But there were a couple of other things flying around, such as this rather spectacular trumpeter hornbill, which we managed to see quite nicely from the bridge above the dam. And then huge flocks of little swift, which obviously breed up under the overhang of the dam, and they came out in absolute clouds, sort of, and swooped around and through the sky in front of us before we left. Heading inland now, and again, the weather wasn't the greatest, so some of the visibility was pretty tricky, but eventually it cleared as we headed inland towards Wakkerstroom, which was our last destination of the trip, to sort of add on because of completely different habitat and a completely different suite of birds. Wakkerstroom Hotel, probably well known to any birder who's worth their salt, because it's one of the destinations for a couple of very good species in Southern Africa, which you can only really see around there. Nice little rustic hotel in town, and the well-known wetland also right on the edge of town, where we stopped briefly to catch up with a couple of the local birds, such as this African swamp hen and the African stonechat. But our main focus was going up into the surrounding hills. And here we are picking up our bird guide on the side of the road, who then was our guide for the rest of the afternoon and sort of early evening, while we went up into the very high-lying areas to try and see what we could find. Visibility was pretty awful, and it was very cold and quite windy. So we weren't too sure what we'd get, but we fortunately did do quite well. Half-streaked chat, one of those sort of lower Drakensberg specials. This is the female. And then a bird I've been looking for a long time was the sort of eastern version of our now 5 species of long-billed lark. They were split from long-billed lark some years ago, and we now have 5 of them. And this was the one that I hadn't really had a good look at yet, so it was nice to get to grips with, and we saw it pretty well. Another special for the area, and probably one of the main birds, a reason why people go to Wakkerstroom birding, is this yellow-breasted Pippet, which we also managed to spot at long and reasonably tall grass, but it did show quite nicely once or twice. Then our guide David took us to a different area of grassland to try and catch up with one of the rare Koran-struck bustards, which is only really found in that part of Southern Africa or in the very, very far north of northern Namibia. So it was one that was very much on our hit list. And here he is striding through the grass in the late afternoon, sort of gloomy light with patches of sunshine, trying to see what we could find. And eventually, luckily, we found a pair of white-bellied bustards. And when the sun came out, this male showed quite nicely at some distance, but at least we saw it pretty well. And it was another, I think it was the last bustard for Southern Africa, which we actually hadn't yet managed to see. So it was a really good bird to almost finish up on. Although there was still a bit more coming the next morning, when this is Norman, a different guide, who took us to his particular patch, which was again a habitat near Wakkerstroom, but very different from what we'd experienced the day before. Here we are birding on sort of private property, but he knows the area well and knows where to find what. This is one of those rarities for that part of the world, bush blackcap. And according to Graham, not too many people get a chance to see this bird, but lots of them get to hear it. It's one of those really elusive warblers which calls like crazy from really dense thickets, but very, very rarely shows itself. So I was extremely fortunate to get this picture. Not the sharpest, but certainly I hadn't really expected to see it, let alone get something approximating a reasonable photograph. Drakensberg Prinia, one of the sort of relatives of our Karoo Prinia down here, but also quite specialized in that part of the world. Just to keep your eyes down does help, because every so often something slithers across your way. Don't think this one was poisonous, but it certainly keeps it's worth keeping your eyes open while you're walking through the bush. Greater double-collared sunbird, taking advantage of some of those fairly sparse flowers that were available on the hillside. This is the female. And another bird that we weren't really that familiar with from Cape Town, and it really only starts occurring from about Port Elizabeth upwards, is this red-throated wryneck. And we'd been really wanting to see the red-winged francolin, and we tried really, really hard. But every time we got francolins, they turned into grey wings, which we do know from down here. Nice to see, but unfortunately the red-winged was one of those that we missed. And then we had another bird we were looking for, which was a little cisticola. But as you can see from Sandy's hair, the wind was getting really strong and really unpleasant. So we decided that looking for cisticolas in a howling gale wasn't an option, and it was time to pack it in. So we headed back to the hotel for a nice brunch in really lovely surroundings for the last hour or so, before we then went back into the thick of Johannesburg traffic, heading back to Joburg at the end of a very nice, long and very highlight-filled trip, which we really enjoyed. But with one last night back at the same guest house where we'd started, the Vanilla Guest House, and one last bird, which we hadn't, strangely enough, come across at all, but there it was in the hotel grounds as it was getting dark, the juvenile spotted eagle owl at the guest house, to finish off a pretty impressive list of birds. For those who are keen on numbers, 284 birds seen in about 9 or 10 days is pretty good going, and a really nice mix of mammals and reptiles as well. And that's my lot. Thank you very much, folks. And thank you for Strike and Room to Grow for giving me the opportunity to share this with you. Thank you.
All right, oh, Mr. Otto, where do we even begin here? You've taken us on a journey of, yeah, you've literally taken us, put us in a box, and you've literally, you know, took us 1,000 miles away, and you've told beautiful stories about this beautiful natural species that we've got in this world. And I just want to, you know, start off before we even go into the questions by thanking you for your enthusiasm and your passion. Some of the things that you've shared with us today, we would not in a lifetime be able to see. And it's individuals like yourselves that make us all appreciate what life has to offer. So thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much. We're doing quite good. We've got a couple of questions for you, and a lot of what we've got here, Master Otto, is just beautiful comments that have been coming in from all our you know, individuals that have joined us for the talk this morning. So let me take a quick couple of questions. I'll take the first two, give you some time to perhaps reflect and give us your feedback on them. And then I'll take just a few more. We're not gonna keep a lot of people, you know, waiting. So let's jump right into it. We've got Mr. Nicholas, who says, I'm just wondering if you know why the bush babies are fed and not left to fend for themselves. And quite an interesting one. Let me just jump onto Roger Abbott as well here, who organized and conducted the whole tour for Otto and his team over there. You know what, while I'm at it, let me just jump into a few, because I see some of them are quite straightforward, just requiring a quick answer from you, Otto.
Okay, well, can I just answer the tour is easy. We went with Graham Snow, who runs Reach Africa Birding. It's a tour company that operates out of Johannesburg, and he pretty much does tours in air-conditioned 4x4 combi caravel vehicles through Southern Africa. So they do trips into Namibia, Botswana, and all parts of South Africa, as well as Zimbabwe. We'd been with Graham a couple of times before to Mozambique and Zimbabwe, and he's a really, really nice person to travel with. It's comfortable, it's relaxed, you don't feel stressed and hustled, the accommodation is always lovely. He's always great company to be with, and it's a small group, so you can, you can interact with the people, and you don't feel that you're standing in a queue waiting to see things, because there's a small number of people. Everyone gets a chance to really enjoy what is out there. So that's that, and he and his wife run this company out of Joburg. So it's called Reach Africa Birding, and if you look at their website, you'll see that they've got quite a large number of trips on offer. And they really, I would certainly highly recommend them. They are really, really nice, and really nice people to be moving around with. The bush babies, well, I guess they feed them because it allows people to see something which otherwise you'd probably hear at night, but you would seldom get a chance to see unless you trundled around the dark with a torch. It's a fruit diet, so it's pretty much what they would be eating normally. And I suppose there's a slightly, sort of, some people would say, well, one shouldn't feed wild animals, but it certainly adds an interesting dimension to a trip, and it was really nice to be able to see them. They only arrive for a couple of minutes, eat what's there, and they're gone. So it's not as if they are being sort of habituated too much. I'm very pleased to have been able to see them, because I've wanted to see a thick-tailed bush baby for a long time, and getting them anywhere else is quite tricky.
Sure. While we are on that topic, if you could just clarify for us, what's the best time and perhaps maybe best place to watch the birds?
Well, November was when the trip was, which is probably, if you're a birder, is one of the better times, because all your northern migrants come down into southern Africa, and things like the cuckoos and a lot of the bee eaters and various other things either move into Europe and then migrate south for our summer and their winter, or they move into sort of the Central African areas, like some of the cuckoos. So if you're wanting to get a good mix of birds, anything from probably mid-October on through to about March into April is the best birding time. But of course, birds are starting to breed as soon as the rains start, and being a summer rainfall region, November would be the sort of start of the summer breeding season. So birds are calling, birds are going into breeding plumage, which just makes them that much easier to see, like the weavers and the starlings and various things like that. When they're not breeding, they move away, and you really don't get a good look at a lot of these species. So November is a good time. It's getting pretty warm, but from end November through to probably early March, it's really very hot and very muggy. So you don't want to go in the middle of summer, because it gets very uncomfortable, especially for us Cape Townians who are not used to that sort of tropical climate. Graham generally runs that tour at around that time, which I suppose is also to tie in with the turtle nesting period, which is one of those sort of trip highlights.
Sure. All right, let me just take one more for the sake of, keeping to time with all our attendees today. Trish is asking us, why are so many birds being renamed? Do you have any idea?
So many birds in?
Why so many birds are being renamed?
Renamed?
Yes.
It's one of those topics that upsets birders. There's a sort of international convention for names. And apparently when South Africa wasn't sort of on the list of places that general birders went to, the birds that occur here, but also occur in East Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, etc., the names were different. So our plovers were their lapwings, and it made it very confusing for people when they started traveling back to South Africa, and they'd see, oh, there's a whole list of birds we haven't seen. And then they get here and they find it's the same birds they'd seen in Tanzania, but with a different name. So there was a big standardization which took place, and I think something over 200 of our birds were renamed at that time, which is now quite a few years ago. But since then, a number of birds have been split. So a thing like a black-shouldered kite, which we all know as one of our favorite raptors, was split from the one that occurs in Australia. And apparently the Australian one got preference. So their bird became the black-shouldered kite, and ours had to be renamed and is now the black-winged kite. So there's a continuous renaming going on as birds with DNA tests being done on them are found to be different species or different subspecies, and that requires them to get different names. Because the first name, the bird that, where the name it was called originally is the name that it has to have at the end of the day. So where a more recent name has come in vogue, they then have to change it to the name that was first known as. So every year there's a couple of names which change, much to our frustration, but unfortunately these things have to happen.
Yeah, sure. Oh, Mr. Otto, I think we could literally sit here and keep you with us, and I can see everybody's just, you know, so delighted from the presentation that you've given. You should look at all these comments. And in fact, our team from Straight Nature, they're very good at collating all these beautiful messages that are coming through. And we will definitely be sharing them with you. Just for a few, you know, from Mr. Nathan, he says a stunning presentation with beautiful photograph. It makes one realize what a wonderful, diverse country of birds, life and blessed with, and this life that we are blessed with. So many thanks to you, Otto. Oh, Cassandra is in the house. Cassandra, hello to you. Cassandra saying, this has been an absolute beautiful presentation. Thank you so much for sharing the beautiful photos and the beautiful stories of all the birds. We've got Glenn. Thank you so much for a superb presentation. Well done, Otto. I mean, it goes on and on and on. So thank you so much. I just want to take this opportunity from everybody that's been here with us, has joined us this morning, to give a big thanks to you. Thank you for your passion. Thank you for your interest in birds, and thank you for sharing these moments with us. We really appreciate it. So thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Any last parting words? Any last parting words from you?
No, I don't think so, but thanks for the opportunity. I believe I was supposed to be on later in the year, so I was quite surprised to be called in at short notice, but I'm very pleased that I had the talk prepared and was able to share it with you, and I'm very pleased that a lot of people enjoyed it. We certainly enjoyed the trip and hope that COVID disappears one of these days and we can start spreading our wings and doing a few more things like this again.
Exactly. I couldn't have said it better myself. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much to all our partners, Room to Grow, Straight Nature, as well as Kirstenbosch team. Thank you so much for this wonderful collaboration. Katie, thank you so much to you. All our love goes to you. The next talk is happening on the 10th of February, which is in the next 2 weeks. And we will be talking about a very interesting topic. In fact, I'm not going to say much about it. Please check out our Facebook page, Room to Grow, Straight Nature, as well as Kirstenbosch, for more details on that wonderful talk that's coming in. Just to give you a hint, Cape Clawless Otter. I'm just going to leave it there. So please be on the lookout for our Facebook page for more information. Ladies and gentlemen, please remember to sanitize, wear your mask, and keep a safe social distance. From myself and all the team that have put this together, thank you so much. We'll see you guys at the next talk. Mr. Otto, thank you so much. All our love goes to you and the family. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All righto. Cheers, everybody. Bye. Have a fantastic day.